A cold evening wind moved through our quiet cul-de-sac when everything changed. Flashing blue lights reflected against our windows, turning our living room into a war zone of colors. My wife stood frozen at the doorway, holding the HOA's $3,500 violation letter she had ignored, because she knew something about that fine the HOA didn't. But what none of us expected was the way the officer would react when he looked at her driver's license and recognized her title. His face drained of color. His voice cracked, and the street fell silent. If you believe in justice over intimidation, truth over HOA abuse, and karma hitting at the perfect moment, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this one remind us that power isn't always where the HOA thinks it is. The night everything unfolded began quietly, almost too quietly, considering the storm that had been brewing for weeks. Our HOA had been pushing boundaries for years, handing out fines like they were a source of personal entertainment. But this time they went too far. They targeted my wife, someone they assumed was defenseless, compliant, and easy to bully. They had no idea who she truly was. It started with a letter taped to our door, a $3,500 fine for unauthorized exterior modifications. The so-called modification? A standard mailbox replacement approved in the HOA's own handbook. My wife read the letter once, exhaled long and slow, and placed it neatly on the counter. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. She didn't even mention paying it. She simply carried on with life as if the fine had never existed. The HOA board, however, didn't appreciate being ignored. Within days, enforcement notices escalated. Threatening emails arrived. Certified letters appeared on our porch like warning flags. The tone of each message grew bolder, more aggressive, dripping with entitlement. And leading the charge was Karen, the board secretary, who treated power like it was a personal weapon. By the second week, I began noticing Karen's SUV creeping past our house at odd hours. She would slow down, stare at the mailbox like it offended her existence, and take photos whenever she thought we weren't looking. The intensity of her obsession was unsettling, but my wife, calm, composed, always steady, remained unmoved. The final escalation arrived one afternoon in a crisp envelope marked, "Final Notice Before Legal Action." It declared that my wife had refused to comply, refused to pay, and therefore the HOA would be seeking immediate intervention from local law enforcement to ensure compliance. My wife read the letter only once. Her expression didn't change. She folded it, placed it with the others, and returned to grading case files on her laptop. A strange stillness filled the room, as if she was waiting for something inevitable. Something she already knew was coming. That night, as the sky dimmed to a muted blue, a sudden glare filled our windows. The unmistakable flicker of police lights splashed across the floor. Tires hissed against asphalt. Engines idled low. 2 police cruisers pulled to a stop in front of our driveway. My chest tightened. My wife didn't panic. She simply closed her laptop and stood. Her movements were precise, deliberate, grounded. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, exhaled, and walked toward the front door with the same confidence she used walking into a courtroom. I followed her, unsure of what to expect. The moment she opened the door, cold night air swept in, carrying the distant hum of crickets and the heavy presence of authority. Karen stood proudly beside the officers, arms folded, chin raised like she had orchestrated the victory of the century. Her lips curved into a smug smile, the kind born from the belief that she had finally cornered us. "There she is," Karen announced dramatically, gesturing toward my wife as though presenting evidence. "The homeowner who refuses to comply. The one ignoring all fines." The senior officer, a tall man with a hardened gaze, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we received reports of non-compliance with community regulations and refusal to pay assessed fines. We're here to verify the situation." My wife remained perfectly still, her face unreadable. Then, without a word, she reached for her wallet, removed her ID, and handed it to him. The officer held it under his flashlight. And then everything changed. The light trembled slightly in his hand. His posture stiffened. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly before darting to her face, then back to the ID again. The transformation happened slowly, like a wave of recognition moving across his features. Karen's triumphant expression faltered. "Ma'am," the officer said, but his voice carried a tremor now, something between shock and disbelief. He swallowed hard. "I didn't realize you're—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The second officer leaned closer to look at the ID, and when he saw the title printed under my wife's name, he stepped back as if he had just witnessed something sacred. Karen blinked, confused. "What's the problem? Just issue the citation. She's ignoring us." The senior officer straightened, cleared his throat, and handed the ID back with both hands, respectfully, almost ceremonially. "Your Honor," he said, voice steadying with formality, "we weren't informed you reside in this neighborhood." "Your Honor." The words hung in the air, heavy and electrifying. Karen's mouth parted in disbelief. Her posture sagged. The officer's entire demeanor shifted from assertive enforcement to deferential caution. My wife simply nodded, calm as ever, as though this moment was expected. The officer continued, "We were dispatched under the impression this was a civil non-compliance matter with an unresponsive resident. That is clearly not the case." Karen sputtered, "Wait, what do you mean, Your Honor? She's just a homeowner. She broke the rules." My wife lifted her gaze, the faintest edge of authority sharpening her tone. "Officer, please continue." He did. "Given your position, ma'am, we will be filing a report regarding the HOA's misuse of law enforcement resources. This appears to be a civil dispute, not a criminal matter. It was inappropriate for the HOA to escalate it to emergency services." Karen's expression melted from superiority into horror. The officer glanced at her with visible irritation. "Ma'am, we'll need statements from you and the HOA board." The shock in the air was palpable. The blue and red lights flickered across Karen's stunned face as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. But the night wasn't over, because what my wife was about to reveal next would shift the power in this community forever. And it would expose exactly why she had ignored the fine from the start. The air outside felt heavier than before, thick with the kind of silence that only follows an unexpected power shift. The police cruiser's lights continued to wash over the houses, pulsing across rooftops like an unspoken warning. Neighbors peeked through curtains, silhouettes forming in darkened windows, all drawn by the unfolding spectacle. Karen stood stiffly in the glow, hugged by her own regret, while the officers waited for direction, only from my wife now. My wife stepped forward with a calm that didn't just settle the tension, it commanded it. She wasn't angry. She wasn't rattled. She simply existed in a level of authority Karen had never imagined she could confront. The senior officer shifted his stance, respectful, attentive, almost protective of her now. "Ignore the fine? Judge?" Karen whispered in shock, the pieces of the puzzle struggling to form in her mind. Her confidence drained from her face like water slipping between fingers. She had weaponized the HOA's threats so casually, so confidently, believing she held untouchable power. But now that illusion was collapsing piece by piece. My wife didn't respond. She didn't even glance at Karen. Instead, she nodded toward the officers. "Would you like to step inside? I can provide what you need for your report." There was no arrogance in her tone, only certainty. The senior officer lowered his head slightly, a subtle bow of respect. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." As they stepped into our home, I followed, closing the door behind them. The atmosphere inside was startlingly calm compared to the chaos outside. Warm lamplight spilled across the living room, brushing against framed certificates on the wall, neatly stacked files on the dining table, and the quiet composure that always surrounded my wife like a shield. Karen remained on the porch, too stunned to move, too humiliated to leave. The second officer turned to her. "Ma'am, please wait here. We'll speak with you shortly." For the first time, Karen didn't argue. Inside, my wife walked to the shelf and retrieved an organized binder, thin, precise, intentionally prepared. She set it on the coffee table and opened it to a section labeled HOA Violations, Legal Grounds and Procedures. The senior officer blinked. "You've been documenting everything?" She gave a slow nod. "Since the day they began issuing baseless fines." The officer studied the documents with a growing frown. Each page detailed inconsistencies in the HOA's enforcement, evidence of selective targeting, sections highlighted from the covenants that contradicted the fines they issued, even timestamps showing surveillance-level behavior from Karen's late-night drive-bys. He exhaled deeply. "Your Honor, I can see this is a pattern." My wife clasped her hands in front of her, posture impeccable. "Yes. And they've escalated beyond their authority. Tonight proves that." His jaw tightened. "They essentially used the police for personal retaliation." "Correct," she replied. "And they chose to do so without understanding the person they were targeting." For the first time since the officers arrived, I felt a sense of quiet pride swell inside me. My wife never flaunted her position, never invoked her title unnecessarily. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just defending herself, she was defending justice in the very community we lived in. The officer flipped another page, noticing something. "Is this signed by the HOA president?" My wife nodded. "Yes. A direct admission that they issued the fine without board majority approval." Karen pushed it through herself. His brow furrowed. "That's a serious breach." She closed the binder and looked calmly toward the front door. "Now you understand why I didn't pay the fine. I wanted their process to unfold naturally, to show how far they would go." A pause lingered in the room. The officers exchanged glances, absorbing the depth of what they were dealing with. This wasn't a petty HOA disagreement. It was an abuse of authority layered in entitlement, pushed by someone who believed she could bully anyone she chose. The senior officer stood tall again. "We'll make sure the misuse of police resources is documented correctly. This is no longer just a neighborhood issue." My wife nodded, her gaze steady. "Good. Because the situation is more severe than they realize." A sudden series of knocks echoed from the door. Firm. Uneasy. "Karen." The second officer stepped outside. My wife and I stayed inside but moved close enough to hear the conversation through the slightly open door. Karen's voice wavered. "Officer, look. This is all just a misunderstanding, okay? I didn't mean for things to go this far." "This was excessive," the officer replied firmly. "You initiated a law enforcement response for something that is not criminal. You will need to provide a formal statement." Karen panicked. "A statement? About what?" She ignored the fine. "That does not constitute an emergency," the officer said. "And you knowingly escalated it." My wife stepped forward and opened the door fully. Karen's eyes darted to her instantly, widening with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Karen," my wife said, her voice carrying a calm dominance that silenced the entire porch. "Do you know why I never responded to the fine?" Karen swallowed. "Because you think you're above the rules?" My wife raised an eyebrow, not in anger, but clarity. "No," she said. "Because that fine isn't legal." Karen blinked repeatedly. "What? Of course it's legal. We issue fines all the time. And half of them violate your own bylaws," my wife replied. "Including this one." The senior officer stepped beside her. "Ma'am, she's right. The documents clearly show the fine was improperly issued." Karen's breath caught. "Improperly? But My wife interrupted gently but firmly. "Karen, the law doesn't bend to personal preference. You ignored the covenants and weaponized authority you don't have." Karen's face twisted with defensive disbelief. "I didn't know she was a judge." My wife inhaled sharply. "You don't need to know someone's title to treat them fairly." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The officer glanced at Karen. We will need the full HOA board here within the next 24 hours. This is now part of an official report. Karen stared blankly into the night. The weight of everything she had triggered pressed onto her shoulders. But little did she know, my wife wasn't done. Because the binder the officers had just reviewed? It wasn't only documentation. It was evidence of something far deeper, something that could dismantle the HOA leadership entirely. And she was ready to reveal the next layer. A layer Karen was absolutely not prepared for. A layer that would expose the board's corruption piece by piece. The night air thickened around the porch as Karen stood trembling under the weight of consequences she never imagined. The flashing blue lights had softened to a steady glow, but the tension they introduced still hovered like smoke after a fire. My wife stepped back into the house, calm and deliberate, giving the officers space to escort Karen down from her cloud of imagined authority. Inside, she placed the binder back on the coffee table with a precision that reflected her mindset, controlled, methodical, prepared. She knew tonight would come. She had been waiting for it, and now that it was here, she was ready to expose far more than an illegal fine. The senior officer cleared his throat as he approached her again. "Your Honor, is there anything else we should be aware of? You mentioned the situation is more severe than they realize." My wife's eyes shifted toward the hallway where another, heavier binder rested on a side shelf. She walked toward it slowly, as though each step was another layer being peeled away from a hidden truth. The officer watched with subtle unease. He seemed to sense that whatever she was about to reveal, it wouldn't be small. She lifted the binder. It was thicker, darker, and sealed with a tab labeled, HOA Financial Discrepancies, Evidence. Setting it down, she opened the first section. The pages inside were dense. Statements, receipts, bank logs, digital screenshots, invoices that didn't match the HOA's published report. Even I felt a chill move through the room. I had seen glimpses of this binder before, but never the full structure. Never the meticulous scope of evidence she had assembled. "This," she said quietly, "is why I knew they would escalate. Corruption grows bold when it believes it's unchallenged." The officers leaned in. The senior officer's jaw tightened immediately. "These are misallocated funds," he murmured. "Thousands of dollars. Possibly tens of thousands." My wife nodded. "Redirected into maintenance fees that don't exist. Payments signed off without board approval. And look here," she flipped the page. "Unauthorized charges placed under homeowner violations. They've been using fines to cover their personal expenses." A deep pause settled over the room, a kind of stillness created when the truth becomes too large to ignore. "How long have you known?" the officer asked. "Months," she replied. "I began noticing irregularities when they issued a fine to an elderly couple for leaving a trash bin out for too long, on a day when the HOA trash truck never arrived. When they refused to explain the discrepancy, I began researching." She flipped another page. The numbers told a story uglier than the HOA itself. The officer took a slow breath. "Your Honor, this is criminal." "Yes," she said. "And I'm giving you full access to it." He turned to me with a look somewhere between disbelief and respect. "She didn't just prepare for tonight. She's been preparing a full case." My wife spoke before I could. "What they did to us is nothing compared to what they've done to some of our neighbors. This isn't about personal retaliation. This is about accountability." The officer nodded firmly. "We'll handle this with the seriousness it deserves." Before they could continue, a voice broke through the night. "Your Honor, please. I need to speak." Karen's voice trembled as she stepped back inside the doorway. Her confidence was completely gone now. Her posture had collapsed into something small, fragile, cracked by the truth she had never expected to face. The second officer moved to stop her, but my wife lifted her hand. "It's fine," she said. "Let her speak." Karen's eyes darted between the officers, the binder, and the woman she had targeted without knowing who she truly was. Her voice fractured as she tried to form words. I didn't know about any of this. I swear. I only issued the fine because the president told me to. He said you were. She stopped herself, swallowing. He said you were trying to undermine the board. My wife's expression didn't change. And that justified escalating to law enforcement? Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out, not any that made sense. She shook her head, frustrated, confused, humiliated. I was just following orders. My wife stepped closer, the warm lamplight cutting across her face, a quiet authority etched in every line. That's the thing about orders, Karen, she said softly. You still have a responsibility to question them. Karen lowered her gaze. She knew it. She had crossed a line, not because she had power, but because she believed she did. The officer turned to Karen. Ma'am, we will need formal statements from the board. All of them. Not tomorrow. Tonight. This is now active. Karen inhaled sharply. Tonight? But the president, he's out of town. Then he can answer by phone, the officer said. This can't wait. Karen realized the gravity of what was happening. For the first time, she understood that this wasn't about a mailbox. It wasn't about a fine. It wasn't even about her petty rivalry. This was about the integrity of the entire HOA. And my wife had just opened the door to dismantling their power structure completely. As Karen stepped back to make a call, her voice cracked, desperate and unstable. We have a problem, she whispered into the phone. A very big problem. While she spoke, my wife walked to the window and watched her. The street still glowed with police lights, painting shifting colors over Karen's shaken silhouette. I moved beside my wife. You knew this would happen. She didn't turn. They forced it to happen. The officers re-entered the house. Your Honor, once we finish statements, we'll be collecting any additional evidence you're willing to provide. My wife nodded. Of course. Then she closed the binder gently, the sound echoing through the quiet room. But before we go any further, she said, there's something else you need to see. The officers exchanged looks again. My wife walked down the hallway toward the home office. Her steps were deliberate, steady, filled with the energy of someone who had been waiting for the world to catch up to the truth she already knew. A moment later, she returned carrying a sealed envelope marked, Confidential Interference Report. She handed it to the officer. This, she said, is the part none of them know I have. The officer opened it slowly. Inside were documents that went beyond finances, emails, directives, plans. Evidence that the HOA president had been manipulating board members, misusing funds, and targeting specific homeowners intentionally, including us. The senior officer whispered, This is enough to remove the entire board. My wife nodded. That's the point. Karen froze mid-phone call, her face paling even further as she overheard. Because this wasn't just a scandal now. It was the beginning of something bigger. Something that would reshape the neighborhood. Something that would dismantle everything Karen thought she controlled. And my wife was just getting started. The night that had begun with flashing police lights had now transformed into a quiet storm inside our home. The weight of what my wife had unveiled, the financial discrepancies, the misconduct, the hidden interference, settled over the officers like an invisible fog. They understood now that this wasn't just an HOA dispute. It was a structure built on manipulation, ambition, and unchecked authority. And they were standing at the center of it. Karen lingered near the doorway, phone clutched in her trembling hand. Her conversation with the HOA president hadn't gone well. Her voice had cracked, words jumbled in panic. The president had offered no comfort, only irritation and an insistence that she fix the situation. But that was impossible now. The situation had outgrown her control. My wife remained perfectly composed, as if she were orchestrating everything with quiet precision. She had expected resistance from the HOA. She had anticipated threats, intimidation, escalation. But she had not expected Karen to involve the police. That single miscalculation by the HOA had accelerated everything. The senior officer took a moment to absorb the contents of the confidential interference report. His breathing deepened. His eyes sharpened. He no longer saw this as a neighborhood matter. He saw it as a case. A serious one. "Your Honor," he said, "this is substantial. More substantial than anything we've been told. You understand what this could lead to?" My wife nodded. "Yes. And that's why I documented every detail carefully." The second officer hovered near Karen, gently guiding her to remain on the porch. She seemed smaller, deflated, stripped of the superiority that had once defined her posture. The look on her face wasn't just fear. It was the dawning awareness that she had been a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Inside, the senior officer turned a page. "These emails, they show direct intent to target homeowners." "Yes," my wife said. "They selectively find residents who question their decisions. They labeled them as problematic and used violations as leverage." He exhaled slowly. "This goes beyond HOA misconduct. This borders on harassment, and possibly fraud." My wife didn't respond. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. The officer closed the envelope with deliberate care. "Your Honor, we'll have to escalate this to the county level. This involves multiple statutes." "Do what you must," she replied. "I'm prepared to testify." Her calmness wasn't just confidence. It was experience. She had stood in courtrooms facing far greater challenges than a corrupt HOA. She knew how to dismantle injustices piece by piece. And tonight she would begin dismantling one that had targeted not just her, but an entire community. A knock sounded at the door again, this time softer, hesitant. The second officer stepped aside as 3 more homeowners approached. Elderly Mr. Rourke from the corner house, the young couple who had recently moved in, and Mrs. Alvarez, who had been fined repeatedly for minor infractions. "We saw the lights," Mrs. Alvarez said quietly. "Is everything okay?" My wife stepped toward them, her expression shifting to empathy. "There's an ongoing investigation," she said gently. "But you're safe. And things are going to change." The senior officer added, "If any of you have experienced irregular fines or questionable enforcement, we'll need your statements as well." The homeowners exchanged glances. Relief washed over their faces, mixed with disbelief. They had endured the HOA's heavy-handed tactics for years, believing they had no power. But seeing my wife standing there, composed, authoritative, respected by the officers, gave them hope. Mr. Rourke removed his hat respectfully. "If you're talking statements, son, I got something to say." The officers welcomed them inside, and soon our living room filled with soft voices recounting their stories. Each one added another layer to the pattern of abuse. The HOA's tactics weren't isolated, they were systemic. My wife listened to every testimony, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She let their voices fill the room, giving them the dignity and space they deserved. It struck me then that this wasn't just about justice for us. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced. As the homeowners spoke, Karen hovered outside, peering through the doorway like someone witnessing the collapse of her own empire. She knew now that the HOA didn't just lose control, they lost credibility. And she had unintentionally delivered the final push. The officer approached her again. "Ma'am, we need the board members' contact information." Karen blinked, tears beginning to form. "They won't talk. I don't know what to say to them." "You'll tell them the truth," the officer said firmly. "The situation is under investigation. They must present themselves for statements." She swallowed hard. "They'll blame me for this." My wife stepped forward, calm as ever. "No, Karen. They used you. And you're finally seeing it." Karen's shoulders trembled. She had carried herself like an enforcer of the community's rules for so long. But now she understood she was never part of the power, she was only part of the illusion. Inside, the officer gathered final note. "Your Honor, we'll return tomorrow with the investigative team. Tonight, we'll file the initial report and begin securing evidence. My wife nodded. I'll prepare everything. The atmosphere in the room grew warm again as the homeowners thanked the officers. A sense of unity began forming, something this community hadn't felt in years. People who had lived only houses apart were beginning to speak, connect, and acknowledge shared frustration. As the officers stepped outside, they paused to address Karen one final time. Ma'am, until further notice, do not issue additional notices or violations. The HOA board is under review. Karen nodded wordlessly. The cruiser's lights flickered once more before they drove away, leaving the neighborhood wrapped in a hush. My wife stood at the doorway, watching the taillights disappear. When the street finally fell silent, she turned to me. They think this is the end, she said softly. But it's only the beginning. There's one final piece they don't know about yet. The calm in her voice shifted subtly. A deeper truth waited beneath it. Something that would not only expose the HOA, but dismantle its leadership entirely. And tomorrow, the entire board would discover that my wife wasn't just a judge. She was the judge assigned to their upcoming case. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The sunlight tinted the street a soft gold, illuminating the houses in a piece that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the night before. But beneath that calm surface, something new thrived: anticipation. Rumors spread like wildfire. Lights flicked on earlier than usual. Neighbors lingered on porches. Everyone sensed a shift coming. My wife woke early, composed yet focused. She moved through the house with the soft determination of someone preparing for a final step in a long journey. The evidence binders were neatly arranged on the dining table. A fresh pot of coffee simmered on the counter. She wasn't anxious, she was ready. By mid-morning, 3 unmarked vehicles rolled into the cul-de-sac. County officials, investigators, the same officers from the night before. Karen saw them from her window, and panic washed over her face as she stepped onto her porch. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from the HOA president, from 2 board members, from a private number she kept rejecting. Nothing could prepare her for what was about to unfold. The investigators approached our door with solemn faces. They weren't here to mediate, they were here to dismantle. My wife opened the door before they knocked. "Good morning," she said calmly. "I've prepared everything you requested." They entered the house with quiet respect. Evidence was reviewed again, this time with sharper eyes, deeper scrutiny. The financial discrepancies, the targeted fines, the signed directives, the misuse of authority, and the sealed confidential documents that revealed the HOA president's strategy to silence problematic residents. The senior investigator closed one binder slowly. "Your Honor, this is overwhelming. No wonder they escalated. The pattern of abuse is unmistakable." My wife nodded. "They relied on intimidation to keep homeowners compliant. When I didn't react the way they expected, they panicked." The investigators exchanged glances. They understood what that meant. They also understood what came next. Then came the knock. A hesitant, unsteady tap-tap-tap. My wife looked up. It wasn't an officer. It wasn't a neighbor. It was the HOA president. He stood on our porch in a suit that didn't quite fit the moment, creased at the shoulders, mismatched in tone, unprepared. Sweat gathered at his collar. His eyes darted from the unmarked vehicles to the investigators, then to my wife. He looked like a man trying to hold together a structure already collapsing in his hands. "Your Honor," he started, forcing a weak smile. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." My wife stepped outside. The investigators followed. The president lowered his voice, but fear seeped through every word. "I didn't know you were involved in this neighborhood. If I had known, I would have handled this personally. We could have resolved everything quietly." My wife raised a hand, not to silence him, but to remove any illusion of negotiation. "You misused authority. You issued fines without proper documentation. You escalated a civil matter to law enforcement. And you involved your board members in actions they didn't understand. He swallowed. I just. You weaponized the HOA, she continued, her tone even but unmistakably final. And you thought you were untouchable. The investigators stepped forward. One of them opened a folder. Sir, we need your statement. Immediately. Karen appeared at the edge of her yard, frozen, unable to decide whether to approach or hide. Her eyes were swollen, evidence of a sleepless night filled with dread. She clutched a stack of papers, her own attempt at documenting her side of the story, but even she knew it wouldn't save her. The president's voice cracked. Can't we discuss this privately? My wife shook her head. This isn't a private matter. This concerns our entire community. The investigators moved to separate him from the growing group of neighbors now slowly gathering outside. They asked him questions calmly but firmly. Every answer he gave only dug the pit deeper. Contradictions, excuses, inconsistent timelines. Sweat glistened on his temple. Meanwhile, Karen shifted closer to my wife, as though standing near her might somehow soften the consequences. Her voice quivered. I never meant for this. I swear. I just thought. My wife looked at her steadily. You thought authority gave you power. But responsibility gives you power. You ignored that. Karen's shoulders slumped. A tear rolled down her cheek. The neighborhood fell silent as the investigators finished their questioning of the president. He stood there shaking, staring at the ground, his illusion of control shattered. Then came the moment no one expected. The senior investigator turned to my wife and said, Your Honor, there's something else. The county assigned a judge to oversee the upcoming hearing regarding the HOA's governance issues. He paused, then continued, Based on jurisdiction, experience, and conflict of interest evaluations, the assigned judge is you. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen gasped. The HOA president looked like the remaining pieces of his confidence had turned to dust. My wife didn't flinch. I'm aware. I received notice yesterday morning. Karen stumbled forward, panic overtaking her composure. You're the judge for our case? That means you knew all along. I knew you were under review, my wife said calmly. But I didn't know how far your misconduct extended until you decided to escalate. Karen's breathing quickened. We can't go to court with you presiding, you'll destroy us. My wife's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in clarity. The court decides based on facts, not feelings, not fear, not gossip, and definitely not power games. The HOA president's voice broke. Your Honor, please, this will ruin everything. My wife spoke with the steady calm of a verdict being delivered. No. You ruined everything. I'm simply revealing the truth. The investigators stepped between them. Sir, ma'am, one said firmly, formal notices will be issued by the county within the next 48 hours. Until then, the HOA board is suspended pending review. Gasps broke across the neighborhood. Suspended. A word heavier than any fine they had ever issued. Neighbors began murmuring, some with relief, some with anger, some with newfound courage. They had lived under the board's shadow for too long. Now, for the first time, the community saw what real leadership looked like. My wife stepped back toward the house, calm and steady. She paused at the doorway, looking over the stunned crowd, the investigators, the shaking president, and the broken Karen. This community deserves better, she said softly. And now it will have it. But as she turned to go inside, the senior investigator added quietly, Your Honor, one more thing. There's evidence the president may have destroyed documents. We'll need your help confirming the timeline. My wife's expression shifted. Not shocked, not surprised, but prepared. Because she had been expecting this too. The story wasn't over. Not yet. Tomorrow, the final piece would fall into place. And when it did, the HOA wouldn't just crumble. It would collapse entirely. The morning after the HOA board's suspension carried a quietness that didn't feel natural. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, Not peaceful, but heavy, waiting for the last strike of lightning. The investigators returned promptly, more serious than the day before. They greeted my wife with respect and urgency, ready to finalize their findings. Every neighbor watched from their windows, their breath held between fear and hope. My wife stood in the center of our living room, calm and prepared. She wasn't wearing her robe or courtroom attire, yet the air around her carried that unmistakable presence, a quiet authority shaped by truth, discipline, and unwavering principles. The evidence binders were organized again, each tab perfectly aligned. She had left nothing to chance. The senior investigator opened the session with a grave expression. "Your Honor," he said, "we've located indications that certain documents were tampered with. We believe some were removed or destroyed by the HOA leadership." My wife didn't react with surprise. "The patterns in their statements suggested as much," she said. "The dates didn't align. Their timelines contradicted each other." "Exactly," he replied. "We'll need your help reconstructing the sequence. The county will request your preliminary analysis before the formal hearing." She nodded and gestured toward the table. "Everything is ready." They sat, and she began laying out a timeline, precise, structured, airtight. Every fraudulent fine, every contradictory directive, each unauthorized expense, each witness statement. She presented it all in a calm, steady voice, the kind that exposed truth without raising its volume. Meanwhile, outside, the HOA president paced the street like a man realizing his empire had been built on borrowed sand. Karen stood near her porch, hands trembling around a mug she never drank from. She kept glancing toward our house, not with hatred now, but with guilt, with recognition, with the uncomfortable understanding that the person she had tried to intimidate had been the only one capable of protecting the community from the corruption festering inside the HOA. My wife finished her explanation and closed her binder softly. "That should give you the full sequence of events." The investigators exchanged stunned looks. One finally said, "Your Honor, your analysis doesn't just confirm wrongdoing, it reconstructs everything they tried to hide. This will form the backbone of the case." She nodded once. "That's the goal." Then came another knock at the door. Heavier. Slower. It was the HOA president again, but this time, he wasn't dressed in a suit. His tie was gone. His shirt loosened. His posture wilted. He looked like a man approaching judgment he could no longer outrun. He stepped into the doorway. "Your Honor, please," he whispered, "I need to speak with you. Just for a moment." The senior investigator stepped forward. "Sir, anything you need to say can be said in front of us." "No," he stammered, his voice breaking. "This is personal." My wife studied him for a long moment before nodding. She stepped outside with him while the investigators waited inside. The two stood on the porch in the soft morning light. Their shadows stretched across the walkway like two opposing eras of the neighborhood, one collapsing, the other rising. The HOA president stared at the ground. "I know what I did," he murmured. "I know it's wrong. But I didn't start out that way. I swear I didn't." My wife didn't speak. She waited. He swallowed. "The power, it gets to you. Homeowners listen. Board members look up to you. It becomes easy to believe you're always right. And when people complain, you see them as troublemakers instead of neighbors." Her voice was calm. "Power reveals character. It doesn't create it." He winced. "I thought I could control everything. Until last night, when the officers recognized you." He shook his head slowly. "That's when I realized you weren't intimidated because you had nothing to fear. And that terrified me more than anything." My wife held his gaze. "You abused the trust of this community." "I know," he whispered. "And I'll face whatever comes. But please, don't let them tear the entire HOA apart. Not completely. It wasn't supposed to be like this." She took a slow breath. "The HOA won't be destroyed. But it will be rebuilt. Under new leadership. And with clear oversight." He nodded, eyes glistening. Thank you. But before she could respond, a voice cut through the air. Wait! Karen rushed toward them, paper trembling in her hands. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't angry. She was remorseful. Your Honor, she said breathlessly, I need to tell you something. Something I should have reported months ago. She held out an envelope, crushed, creased, but undeniably real. Inside were handwritten notes from the HOA president instructing her to issue fines to specific residents, to make examples of them. She had kept them, maybe out of fear, maybe out of guilt, maybe because deep down she knew those pages would one day matter. My wife studied the note. They were undeniable. The HOA president closed his eyes. His last defense crumbled. Karen's voice cracked. I'm sorry. I didn't understand what I was being used for. My wife nodded slowly. Thank you for bringing this forward. The investigators stepped outside at that moment. They reviewed the note. The senior investigator closed his folder. This confirms deliberate targeting, he said. We'll add this to the case file. The president exhaled shakily. It's over, isn't it? My wife didn't soften. The old HOA is over. But the community will recover. The investigators handed the president a notice. You are officially removed from the board pending criminal review. Neighbors watched from a distance, some with relief, others with sympathy, all with understanding. A corrupt system had fallen, but the community it oppressed would now have room to heal. The investigators thanked my wife and departed. The unmarked vehicles rolled down the street. The president walked away slowly, no longer a figure of authority, just a man who had learned an overdue lesson. Karen approached my wife one last time. I know you'll be the judge on the case, she said softly. And I know what's coming. But thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like. My wife nodded gently. Then learn from it. Karen turned and walked back to her home, not defeated but changed. As the neighborhood quieted again, my wife stepped inside and closed the door. The binders were still on the table. The morning light painted her face in a golden glow, dignified and powerful. I looked at her with awe. She wasn't just my wife. She was the reason justice still meant something in this neighborhood. And when the hearing came weeks later, she delivered a ruling that didn't just punish wrongdoers. It rebuilt the community's trust. The HOA that tried to intimidate her had been exposed, dismantled, judged, and rebuilt under honest leadership. And it all began with a $3,500 fine they thought would scare her. Instead, it became the fine that took down the entire corrupt HOA.